A simple formal statement in declaration of uh, the misuse of the word transcendental in connection to Heidegger. For instance, Zizek's claim that Heidegger is super transcendental. The first step starts with Heidegger's being Seinfrage, or being question, in that Heidegger says any beginning of the being question must first admit that we're already operating within an understanding of being, and that this understanding is itself a being, an entity. Each particular understanding of being is not being, but yet somehow we have some intimation of what question we're asking. There's all the beings, there's the beings and being. That's the Heidegger's starting point. The question of the transcendental would seem to be a specific construction of what being is, which takes many forms. So even if we ask, what does transcendental mean? Transcendental, which would already be an entity in this sense of an interpretation of being, there's many answers which are each themselves entities. So that if we really want to go to the question properly, we don't get there that way. So that there's a simple analogy between the claim that we're operating within an understanding of being, and that understanding is in being and therefore not being, and the illicitness of bringing in this historical concept of the transcendental and connecting it to Heidegger. Okay, so end that part of the sort of the formal argument, and then just some comments on how transcendental has been construed in the tradition, what the word is supposed to mean, and how it comes into Heidegger and what Heidegger says about it. We have the problem of the agathos, or the good, in Plato, such that it becomes a problem to see how the world, the moving world as we find it, of particulars, things which have only one instance and will decay in time, a redwood tree, a particular redwood tree, which will grow and die, and the universals, which are everlasting and do not decay in time, the highest of which is the agathon, or the good, how they can have a shared ground, or how everything, including the good itself, can be supported by the good, so that one gets this problem that repeats itself in the background of Descartes, so that even though I misstated this in the past somewhat, I was misled by some scholars who sometimes like to say Descartes, to be, I guess, to quip in a way, to say Descartes has three substances. But strictly speaking, Descartes only, is the common view is correct that Descartes only has two substances, extension and cognition, because the third substance, God, cannot be understood as a substance. A substance is something which is self-subsisting and needs no support from anything else, but rather it has to be in some way pushed in the direction of Paul's statement about the unapproachable light. God would have to be the ground, which is neither supported by cognition, cognition supporting extension, or extension supporting cognition, but somehow the support of both and not either of them. So this is a medieval question. That's a long question, and therefore, properly, it's more like simply a mysterious dispensation, which is then, for instance, you get a better explication of this in Strauss's introduction to the Spinoza book, where he's talking about Heidegger and the change between Heidegger and the Jewish tradition and the prophets, where there's always in the biblical tradition, there's always tacitly an assumption, which then, in the light of the Greek tradition, gets called this assumption of the good, and then you get, of course, the famous Thomistic formula that the evil is the deprivation of good, so that we're always the Catholic view that we're always dealing in this sort of a priori structure of the idea of the good. And that's the notion. The good is transcendental in this medieval sense, but there's other ones. Truth, for instance. But in the main usage that's proximate to Heidegger is we have, of course, this after Kant, we had the Transcendentalists in America and so on. This notion of the sublime and so forth. These structures but it comes out of Kant. The notion of something beyond experience, which structures experience, so that we can't actually have an experience of this a priori of space, the Cartesian extension, in its as it is itself. We're amidst it. Or just see the kind of the result. We can't see it like we could see the structure of the eye, and then claim the structure of the eye is the support for the possibility of the visual world. You can't. It's somehow it's inaccessible in its base, in its foundation. It's just everything simply is that way. That doesn't bother Kant really so much, I don't think, because Kant thinks this is simply as far as we can go. We can't give an empirical account of why there is spatiality. So it's kind of like this analytic philosophy talk about the furniture of the universe. There's a basis beyond which you cannot go behind, and then the transcendental is then this question of how far can you push to the edge of that to make sure you're getting the real stuff. And then there's various other forms of approaching those questions about the limits of experience. And of course Leibniz's formula, which kind of set up this kind of sense of the transcendental, that there's nothing in the cognition that wasn't first in empirical experience, except the very structure of cognition itself. Then we get to Heidegger, and Heidegger's, so far as I can see, Heidegger never describes himself as, or his project as transcendental, but he's always saying things like, he's basically talking about the Catholic tradition, or talking about different uses of the idea of the transcendental in the tradition. But it somehow doesn't work with the being fragga to understand it in those terms. I tried to indicate that with the initial statement, and I think um, the full direct question of being must be taken in such a way that it can't be treated as anymore as a transcendental problem. So that yields then various difficulties along the lines of if the students of Heidegger that think they're more advanced are questioned by people like this Daniel Bonavik with his interpretations, where he likes to talk about the transcendental in Heidegger, he likes to talk about consciousness in Heidegger.